With the US elections just 2 weeks away and deadlock over Brexit negotiations, COVID-19 second wave hitting the globe, how will that affect the financial markets? To help us digest all the economic data, we're joined by Bob Mason of FX Empire. This is your week ahead. Hello, Bob, and thank you once again for joining us. A lot to get through this week, so let's dive straight in. The US elections just 2 weeks away, Brexit negotiations on a knife edge. What will be the key drivers that we should be looking out for next week?
It's a busy week ahead on the economic calendar. We've got less than 2 weeks to go for the US presidential election, but data still counts. From the US, we've got consumer confidence and core durable goods orders, key drivers on Tuesday. The focus will then shift to weekly jobless claims and the all-important GDP numbers. Third quarter GDP numbers out of the US on Thursday as well, garnered plenty of interest. And then wrapping up the week, personal spending and inflation figures. So those are the key drivers for the US dollar on the economic calendar. For the Eurozone and the Euro, also a busy week. We got German unemployment figures, the IFO business expectations numbers, and then we got retail sales out of Germany and France and GDP numbers out of Germany and France that will also garner plenty of interest. Obviously, we got, the spike in new COVID-19 cases. So, how bad was the third quarter? Could get worse in the fourth. For the pound, however, it's a quiet week on the economic data front. So not much going on there. On the monetary policy front, the euro is in action and the ECB on Thursday as well. So will there be any promise of further moves? Obviously, the pandemic is causing rife across the EU. So, the ECB will need to at least promise, more action. But, Lagarde does tend to push the boat and, pass the buck on to EU member states to deliver. So let's see how that press conference goes.
So it seems that the US elections are the key drivers behind the major currencies of the world. But how about the Commonwealth currencies, specifically the loonie and the Aussie dollar? What should we be looking out for there?
For the loonie in the week ahead, relatively quiet week on the economic calendar. We have the RMPI and GDP numbers. Expect August GDP numbers to be the key driver in the week. Main event of the week, however, is the Bank of Canada monetary policy decision on Wednesday. So unlikely to be any moves, but at least the promise of more, particularly with the COVID-19 pandemic and the second wave hitting key economies. For the Australian dollar, inflation figures due out in the early part of the week. Those will influence, particularly with market sentiment towards RBA monetary policy. Further easing is expected next month, so expect Aussie dollar reaction to the numbers. For the Kiwi dollar, business confidence figures due out in the early part of the week, that will influence the Kiwi dollar, though expect, figures from elsewhere, GDP numbers from obviously the Eurozone and the US to be more influential in the week.
So we need to keep an eye out for the Canadian GDP data releases coming up next week. But regarding Asia, our Asian giants, Japan and China, what can we expect from there?
The Japanese yen, relatively quiet week. We've got retail sales and industrial production figures due out in the early part of the week. And later on in the week, we've got inflation figures as well. Not much influence on the Japanese yen. We're not expecting, at least anyway. Bank of Japan is in action in the week. Will they eventually and finally make a move on monetary policy and ease further? The Japanese economy continues to struggle in the wake of the global pandemic that is now hitting wave 2 going into the winter. So further support is going to be needed there. So will they make a move? That's going to be particularly interesting. Outside of that, obviously, politics is going to be a key driver for the yen. We saw the yen visit 104 levels last week. So could we start seeing a move towards, 102, 101 levels and then 100? For the Chinese yuan, it's quite weak. There's no economic data to provide direction for the Asian markets and the yuan in the week. So it's all down to the PBOC through the week.
So a relatively quiet week to look for in the Asian markets. Lastly, let's focus on geopolitical risks. A lot going on. US elections in 2 weeks, Brexit negotiations at a tipping point, and the spread of COVID, maybe a second wave. How's that affecting the markets?
Away from the economic calendar, on the geopolitical risk front, we've got obviously the US elections. Markets are favouring a blue wave, so we're not only going to be looking at the polls and the US presidential election, but also the Senate polls. with Democrats needing a clean sweep to support market risk sentiment and hopes of further stimulus in the new year to support the US economy. Then there's Brexit, lack of direction, and progress following Boris Johnson's call to end of negotiations while leaving the door ajar that led to the pound visiting 131 levels last week. And then you got COVID-19. We're seeing the second wave ahead of the winter months. So that could be quite dire, and we're not seeing a vaccine just yet. So expect that to have a material impact. Further lockdown measures, and that economic recovery is going to be, railroaded going into the end of the fourth quarter.
Well, that's all we have time for today, Bob. Thank you so much for joining us, and I'll see you again next week. That was The Week Ahead with Bob Mason of FX Empire. In the meantime, keep up to date with all the latest developments in the market by following us on all our social media outlets.